again.
Shut up!
Time to relax and forget each care.
What the hell is that?
Just settle back in your easy chair.
Hey!
Here is entertainment for you. You'll find it so enjoyable too. So listen to all from beginning to end, 'cause your friend
Joy, oh happy day.
John Ford
is here again.
So here's the question of the hour. Where do you get your best ideas? I don't mean where do those best ideas come from? I mean, where are you when you get your best ideas? Is it when you're sitting on the crapper? Is it when you're driving in your car? Now, and best ideas will keep in quotes, because I'm not sure what I consider to be best ideas are necessarily what you would consider to be best ideas, or what anyone in the entire known universe and galaxy would consider to be best ideas. But I have a tendency to come up with really good ideas when I'm taking a shower. Are you like that too? Well, if you are, you're pretty weird. Yeah, it's for some reason, when I'm scrubbing and the bubbles are going, I come up with brainstorms that to me seemed brilliant at the time. It's like when you dropped acid and you figured out the meaning to life, the universe, and the everything, and it wasn't 42. It was really deep and mysterious and suspenseful. And then afterwards, 8 hours later, when you've come down off your trip, one, you either can't remember it, or two, you remember it and think, it seemed brilliant at the time, but boy, was that stupid. Now, when I come up with an idea in the shower, it's often kind of interesting. I've actually written songs in the shower. Not singing them out loud, but crafting the lyrics in my head. Whether or not they were good songs or bad songs, that I can't really even tell you. That's sort of up to the beauty in the eye of the beholder and all that. But the other day, as I was doing the bubbly, scrubbly thing in the shower, I was thinking about the first radio job I ever had. This is going back quite a few years. In truth, the first radio job I ever had was at a black gospel station. It was a tiny little AM daytimer. It was a tiny little AM daytimer. Now, for those not in the radio world, daytimer means is that they couldn't be on at night. It was a AM signal. AM is like BM, except it's not on FM. For those of you who don't know what AM is, I realize we're living in a different age now. But it was an AM signal, and it was called WEXY, Wexy. Not to be confused with WAXY, Waxy, which was an oldie station, the one that had Rick Shaw on it. So, yeah, my first job was at the station called Wexy, and it was a AM daytimer. It probably had like 1,000 watts. And in a pattern where they have multiple towers, so it wasn't just equally radiated. In other words, it went straight up in the air and straight back down. Outside of the format being black gospel, nobody really, not very many people listened to the damn thing. It was kind of an interesting gig. One of the things I would have to do is I would have to show up at like 5 o'clock in the morning and go through the teletype, the wires, the wire, the UPI and AP. And I would have to put together, and this is amazing, I would have to put together a 1/2 hour newscast in about 10 minutes before 6 o'clock in the morning. Half asleep, and I'm a teenager, for God's sakes. And of course, I would screw around with the news, but half an hour, try reading a half an hour's worth of news sometimes, and it was all just rip and read. I did the best I could. And some of my friends would listen, and I would insert their names into the story. Like, Winston Churchill today met with Fred Smith. Of course, Fred Smith was my friend. And I would just make up stuff in the news, because I knew nobody was listening anyways, and who would know? It was a black gospel station. Like they would know who Winston Churchill was hanging out with. And this is not a disparaging mark. And it was 6 o'clock in the morning or 5:30 in the morning or whatever it was that the station signed on, whatever daylight was. Half an hour worth of news. So I would screw around with the news and just rip and read off the teletype. But the reason I started thinking about this station that I worked at, this black gospel station, it was really awful. Except for the music. The music was kind of cool. I mean, it was like, real, honest to God, jumping black gospel music. I mean, it was the real deal. Can't remember too many of the artists, but it was like the real McCoy, not to use like an Irish word. It was like the real Rufus. It was a great radio station as far as music. And the disc jockeys, then the disc jockeys were all old black guys. And they were just awful. I mean, they were horrible. They were the worst disc jockeys you ever heard in your life. And what they would do is people would call up on the phone while they're playing the records, and they would say, dedicate this to Maybelle, or dedicate this to Uncle Ralphie, or dedicate this to Sister June. And what they would do is they would turn the music up and down in the middle of the song. And, they'd be playing, who dapped it, oh, Jesus, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then they'd turn it down, and then they'd go, this goes on to Brother Rufus. And then they'd turn it back up, who jap-a-dap, doo-da-doo. I'd play music and show you how they do it. But current laws and regulations are so freaking prohibitive by playing music on podcasts that the FBI is going to come banging on my door and haul me off to the Who's-Go. And I don't need that. I don't want it. But yeah, and they would do this over and over. Jesus, yeah, yeah, yeah. This goes on to me, but Jesus, yeah. And this goes on to Brother Rufus, yeah, but Jesus is the Jesus, yeah. And this goes on to Mythopalooza, yeah, Jesus. And they would. It was so bad, and we had wooden floors. The floors were wood that, and it was a sit-down operation. I mean, they weren't standing up doing their show. They were sitting down. I mean, these were old guys, too. And they would pound, that music would be playing, and they would pound their feet on the floor. And you'd have to put and this was records. There were records. They played records. It wasn't even high-tech cart machines, man. They played records, and they would literally put the quarters on the records, and they would pound their feet on the floor. Boom, boom, boom with the music. Jesus, yeah, boom, boom. And you could see, like, the papers and stuff bouncing up and down on the desk, right? And sometimes they would get so into it that the record, the needle would come up and Jesus, yeah. This goes on to be Bill Jesus. Boom, 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 pounding their feet. It was really, really bad. It was as bad as you could ever possibly consider doing a broadcast radio. But there was one thing. There was something that I learned from that. And I even realized it at the time, even though I was just a dumb kid. What the hell did I know? What the hell do I know now? Not a whole hell of a lot. The older you get, the more you realize you don't know. But there was one thing that I learned that was amazing and that I kept with me. And it became more important as life continued on its journey, is that these guys, they were having fun on the radio. They were really enjoying what they were doing. They were smiling. They were having a blast, man. They were having a ball, and it was infectious, and the listeners could tell. And it went through that microphone. It went out on the airwaves with the power of the air, and it went into the speakers of Brother Rufus that was listening at home. And the listeners could feel this fun and excitement that they were having. Like a preacher, man. And that was something, well, trying to remember the name of the one guy that was like the main guy. Brother something and the old, Brother Rufus and the old ship of Zion. No, Brother Lee and the old ship of Zion on Wexy AM. You couldn't understand half of what he said. He mumbled through things. Obviously, his dentures were ready to fall out. He was aged. It was the worst radio you could ever possibly imagine. The music was cool, in my opinion. Quarters on the turntables. But he was having fun. And the listeners could tell. There goes my dog growling at the pussycat again. And the listeners could tell, and it came through the speakers, and that part of it was just amazing. He was having fun, and that's something you can't teach somebody how to do in broadcast, or I would imagine even with a stupid podcast crap. And I remember another guy that I worked with, and this was at WSHE in Miami, and he had this down. He nailed this. He had great mic technique. Great mic technique, man. Pulling off that mic, learning what that pattern was, and making it sound kind of cool. His name was Jim White. He went by on the air at WSHE as Long Jim White, and I think he's still in Dallas at the rock station there, the one that guy Redbeard was on. Boy, was he a nothing. But Jim White, on the Bo and Jim show. So anyways, when I worked with Jim White years ago at WSHE in Miami, this was, early in my radio broadcasting career, he had stayed on after the station had switched from a very, very cool format. I mean, of course, it was always a rock format, but it was like, I think they called themselves the new rock of the new wave. In other words, they were playing all this new wave music back in 79 and 78 when everybody else was jumping on the classic rock bandwagon. And I think in 79, they won the Rolling Stone Readers Poll for the best radio station in the United States, which was kind of a big deal. And one of the reasons it was a big deal is because every year that was won by, I believe it was, and if I'm wrong, don't shoot me, WMMS in Cleveland, and that station won it every year. And they had always been accused of stuffing the ballots to win that. So even if they did stuff the ballots, they didn't win that year because she was such a great radio station. And you got to thank, the Milners that own the station for letting Tommy Milner do that. And Jim White was doing afternoons during that, and he had stayed even after the station was sold, and it switched to the Burkhart Abrams Superstars format. For those of you not in radio, this means nothing, except that they had switched from this really cool alternative rock thing in 1979 to your mainstream rock format, a Lee Abrams, Burkhart Abrams format. But Jim White, he wasn't, when he was on the air at She, Jim White, he wasn't the most amazing jock ever, but he loved what he was doing. And just like Brother Lee in the old ship of Zion, it came through on the air. And he had this great mic technique where he'd back off from the Sennheiser and say, "Hey, what's happening, rock and roll?" And he was so infectious when he was on the air. The point I'm making here is that if you're having fun, if you believe in what you're doing, if you're having a good time, the Wolfman would be the perfect example of this. The listener can tell on the air that you're enjoying yourself, that you're having fun, man, that you're really into it, that it's part of your being, and it infects through the airwaves to the listener like a staph infection, like a venereal disease. But they can tell, man. And as opposed to just going through the motions, reading the liner cards, doing your thing, doing nothing, they can tell when you're stomping your foot on the floor and the needles are going up and down on the record and you're really enjoying it and not just going through the motions.
It's the John Ford Podcast, the Evening Rancor.
Since I seem to be on this kick of reminiscing about the old radio days this week on the Evening Rancor, what the hell? Let's continue the ponderings. In many ways, it's better than bitching about politics. God knows everybody gets tired of that. Don't you get tired of that? I get tired of that. The insanity from both sides of the aisle. Anyways, let me take you back to the mid-1970s. I think it was probably 77 or early 78. I'm thinking it was 77. I took a part-time job at a country station in Southeast Florida in Davie. Actually, the city of license was Davie. I think the station was actually physically in Hollywood, Florida, just west of Sheridan Street. Back then, that used to be just nothing but cow pastures, man. And Davie was always sort of like the cowboy area of South Florida, kind of like the Texas of Fort Lauderdale. But I took this job at a country station. It was AM station 1520, I think, 1580, I don't know, 15-something. It was WGMA, and it was a pretty cool little country station. You know, it had a very active country list. And I enjoyed working on it, although I never really thought I would want to work on a country station, but I took this gig at this country station. And I will say this about country stations, they had the best listeners. I mean, these people were pleasant, nice, and great to talk to, and they just loved the radio stations. I think country listeners are just great listeners. Anyways, this was kind of a heritage country station for South Florida. It was one of the few country stations on the dial. There were no FM country stations back then. And the owner of this station decided to change formats, and they hired a guy out of Hawaii by the name of Dave Denver. Well, that was the name he went by on the air. Richard Lippincott was who he was, who later became a record guy and, had programmed a lot of stations. He had programmed this station in Honolulu, which had this guy on named Aku, who had like a 50 share, some crazy thing, which meant that of all the radios that were on, half the people were listening to this guy when he was on. But Dave, Dick, whatever you want to call him, he had this idea for this format, and he said, we can put this format on in Miami because it's the Miami market, Miami-Fort Lauderdale Metro, and it'll be so wild that people will go to AM to listen to it. If you would think about this today, an AM trying to compete with Y100. It sounds crazy. It was crazy. It was never going to work. But, I guess they paid him enough to give it a shot. And he brought a bunch of people with him to this radio station, this 1580 or whatever it was, WGMA in Davie, Florida, to switch the format. He brought a bunch of people with him from Hawaii. There was a guy by the name of Nolan Cruz who went by the name Susan Cruz in Hawaii. And Buddy Hollis, I think, who later went to the rock station K102. As the station began to flip, I was, I think, the only person they kept on, and they gave me overnights, which I was happy to have. Now, what made the station so strange is that, and you think about this as I explained what this station was to you, you could never, ever get away with this today. It was called Radio for Singles Only, and it had a silhouette of a woman, kind of like that silhouette that the Peterbilt trucks had, but it was in pink, of the naked woman reclining. And the whole concept was like sex radio. So it was done like a top 40 format, like a CHR format, all very forward motion, all talk over music, and, lots of, it was a CHR. It was a top 40 station. But we had Playboys and penthouses strewn all over the place. That was where you got your ad-libs for your breaks. And the PSAs were wacky, man. The public service announcements were things like, I can still remember this one. After sex, a warm, damp towel is the perfect thing for your mate. Yeah, that was the PSA, right? That was a public service announcement. I always wondered how they were going to get that past the FCC as serving the public interest. It was actually kind of a cool radio station, but the things, the innuendos and the sexual-oriented stuff that we would do on there, you could never, ever get away with it today. Not because we live in such a conservative world, but because we live in such a world that is buffeted by this, social justice world, the social war. It's us just social justice warriors. They would never allow anything like this on. It wouldn't be Jerry Falwell out there protesting your radio station. It would be the left. Isn't that wacky how things have worked out? Isn't that just strange? So here's the story I'm going to tell you about that station. The day we were going to flip that format, all the music had been carted up, and it's a very busy thing. We had recorded all this stuff and it was ready to go. And Dave Denver, Richard Lippincott, had gone on the air. And he was actually okay on the air. I said to him once, how come you're not on the air? You're kind of good. And he said, look, if I'm the best thing I can find to put on the air, we're all in trouble. But he was actually okay on the air. So he opened up the mic for about 4 or 5 hours before we flipped the format at midnight, I guess starting at about 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening. And this station was in the middle of nowhere, literally in a cow pasture, which I'm sure now that area is built up and has $1 million homes on it. But it had a big parking lot in front of it where the towers were. And he flipped the mic and went on the air and just started lambasting country listeners. Country listeners are just people that sit around picking their nose and they're stupid and taking phone calls on the air from these country listeners. And man, did they get pissed. So what ended up happening is, and I had split just before all the mayhem started. What ended up happening, as I took off, and he was doing this on the air, I was like, I have to get home and get some sleep because I've been taping music and carting up music for hours, the station had a big plate glass window in front of where the parking lot was. And all the country listeners started showing up in the pickup trucks and, drinking beer, getting drunk and yelling and screaming and throwing things at the window. And eventually it came to the point where he had to dive under the studio with mic in hand and ask for the police to come because these people were rioting and they were getting ready to trash the radio station. And the cops did come and everything went wacky. And the format eventually did flip to the lady, which I think... Yeah, The Lady, 1320. The Lady on 1320 for singles only. And you think about it, in the 70s in South Florida, that format should have worked if it was on FM, right? Just wouldn't have worked on AM because nobody was listening to music on AM at that point, or at any point, after the 60s, early 70s. Because of that incident, we ended up getting all kinds of press, national press. Playboy magazine covered it. You couldn't have asked for better press. I mean, as far as the launch go, you couldn't have asked for a better launch, but people just didn't listen to it because it was on AM. And boy, what a weird place to work, man. You can imagine the listeners to that thing, the crazy women in the 70s in Miami. That would, for sexual favors, for these ugly disc jockeys at this radio station. It was weird, man. It was wild. One of the strangest trips I've ever been on.
I'm the happiest guy.
He's the luckiest guy.
'Cause I just bought a new Ford.
From a wonderful dealer.
Wow, what a dealer!
For a Ford or a fine used car.
And I guess that's about it for this week's program. Thank you for coming with me down Radio Memory Lane. Hope some of it was interesting. I've got even more bizarre stories than that, but that'll have to wait for another time. Next week, who knows what the hell we'll talk about on the John Ford Podcast, The Evening Ranker. Till then...
This program is for re-educational purposes only. Resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is probably intentional. Contents under pressure, use only as directed, some assembly required. Void where inhibited, batteries not included, use only as directed. If confusion persists, consult your physician. Driver does not carry cash. This disclaimer is subject to change without notice.